On Life and Meaning is brought to you by Blumenthal Performing Arts, celebrating its 25th year presenting the best in performing arts, sharing and employing the arts as a major catalyst to strengthen education, building community cohesiveness, and advancing economic growth. To discover the best in events and performances, visit blumenthalarts.org.
And I went to listen to Grace Slick because I was 22 and Grace Slick was sexy and cool. But at my age now, I would listen to Janis Joplin because she was all about soul. And I think that's kind of a way to think about how my life has gone in some ways, from that young, hippie, long-haired young woman that wanted to be cool and sexy, to now being older and understanding how important wisdom is and knowing that soul is really what's important.
Debra Bosley brings clarity to complex information. She is a plain language expert who re-envisions language so that readers might better understand and respond. She is owner and principal of the Plain Language Group, a consultancy that helps businesses improve internal and external communication. Her work includes developing and designing documents to meet plain language regulatory requirements, helping clients communicate more effectively, and serving as an expert witness on plain language compliance. She is a former professor of English at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. In this episode, we explore plain language, what it is and why it matters, and a personal journey of repairing the world, one sentence at a time. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be here.
It's great to have you. What is technical communication?
Well, technical communication is an academic field in which we teach students how to write in a way that makes it easy for non-technical people to understand. So a lot of the focus is on helping engineers write more clearly, helping business people avoid jargon, helping computer science folks write user manuals that users can actually understand. So I always think of it as taking complex information and making it easier for non-experts to understand.
And how does it differ from other forms of communication?
Well, for one thing, within an academic environment, it's different because it's very practice-based. So they're not writing essays to impress their professors. They're not writing research papers that only their professor's going to read. The way I taught tech writing was that students had actual projects with real companies or real nonprofits. They interviewed potential audiences. They wrote proposals, reports, manuals, some websites, some of which actually were used by the entity that we were working with. So it's very practice-based. However, it comes out of the tradition of rhetorical theory, which is persuasion. So how do you write in a manner that will inform and at the same time persuade someone to take action?
Are there theories of technical communication?
Yes, tech communication is really based on a lot of rhetorical theory, so the Aristotle and the art of persuasion, based on social constructionism, which is an academic jargon for collaboration. How do people make meaning in collaboration with others? So it's based on psychology as well. How do people interact? How do you change behaviors within teams? Because many technical documents, or actually many documents in business, are created by teams of people, not just by one individual. So there's a little bit of project management in there. So I think in some ways I always think of people who are good at technical writing understand human behavior. They understand how people process language. They understand how people read. They understand what will be persuasive. And they understand how to inform with empathy, which is not something we always think of when it comes to transactional writing.
In a classic sense, Aristotle speaks of ethos, pathos, and logos when it comes to rhetoric.
Correct.
Is that in fact part of technical communication?
Yes, absolutely. So ethos would be the ethical stance. How much do I believe the person who is giving me the information? Am I suspicious of, for instance, what a corporation might tell me? Or have I had good relationships with this particular agency and therefore I trust them? Or I know the person who's giving me the written advice. So the ethical stance of the purveyor of the information is very important in terms of how the audience accepts it. Logos is what is the logical argument that's being presented. So if, for instance, someone is trying to convince me to buy a particular investment, what are the logical pieces of information they're giving me that will lead me to the conclusion that they would probably like me to reach? And do I trust them? And then pathos is the emotional response, which actually I think we forget a lot about emotions. Research shows that people read with their emotions. That seems obvious if you're reading literature or poetry. But if I'm getting an insurance policy and I don't understand the first 5 words in the insurance policy and the tone is very legalistic, therefore off-putting, and I really need to make this decision, so there's frustration and anxiety and fear all around that information. Or for instance, I get my statement from my investment advisor and I still don't know how much I'm paying them every year to give me this advice. So that emotion can get in the way of people understanding the information. So that's why in tech writing and in plain language, we really, or at least I do, try to emphasize that you need to be, when you write, you need to be very empathetic towards the emotional needs of your audience, not just their need for the actual information.
How is good tech writing any different than good writing?
Well, every piece of writing is situated within a context. So a novel is going to be read maybe at the beach, and it's going to contain story and character development, etc. Poetry is perhaps going to help open your heart and open your mind to images you hadn't thought of before. So let's put that over to the side. Then we have other forms of writing, like writing within an academic environment. And if one is a professor writing within an academic environment, you have to write for the people who are actually going to be reading that article, and that often really isn't your students, even if you assign them that piece of writing. That academic article is really written for your peers who will judge whether or not it's worthy of being published in a journal so that you can therefore get tenure. And so technical writing really focuses much more, I think, on the broader span. And in fact, I actually use the words plain language now more than tech writing. But it focuses on the broad span of making information easy for people to understand and use. Not to impress people, not to make yourself look like you're part of, I'm going to use some jargon now, of what we would call a discourse community. That is, everyone who is in your field understands the jargon you're using, no matter what field it is. So we try to wash that out so that the average person can interact with all the transactional information he or she interacts with on a daily basis. And we're not trying to impress people with our intelligence, our vocabulary. We're just trying to say, we want this to be easy for you to understand and use.
Do you consider an inter-office email technical communication?
I consider anything that's transactional technical communication. So yes, an inter-office email, even if the jargon is appropriate. Well, I'll give you an example. So when I was getting ready to retire at the university, I got an email about where my money was going to come from when I retire, whether I was part of the state plan or TIAA-CREF. And the email went on and on and on, as many do, on, and at the very bottom it said, if you are not in the state plan, this does not apply to you. Well, I had wasted 10 minutes trying to get through all of this, only to discover at the very end that it didn't even apply to me. So a good technical writer would have said, the very opening statement should say, who is this intended to be read by? Then the reader makes the decision as to whether to go forward or not. So the strategies of technical communication, the way it's structured, emphasis on audience, using headings, making it easy for people to skim the information to find what they're looking for, all of those apply in most writing situations that aren't fiction, that aren't journalism, that aren't PR. Marketing even uses some of what we do. And journalists certainly know about plain language. Whenever I'm interviewed, they always get what I do.
What makes it difficult to do?
First of all, school doesn't teach us how to write that way. So high school and college, or at least college, tends to teach us how to write for an academic context. It doesn't really tend to teach us how to write for an actual professional context once you leave the university. Even in business classes, it's really only your professor who probably ends up reading whatever you wrote. Or as an example, I had an engineering faculty and I was doing some work with his students and he was having them write a research article. Well, the chances are that 90% of those kids will never write a research article to be published in an academic journal. So the whole context that he, as the professor, had given to them was really inappropriate for teaching them how to write as real engineers write for real clients. I think it's a function of clear thinking. How clearly are you thinking about what your audience needs? In fact, I always say, tell your audience what they need to know, not what you want to tell them. Because usually if we're an expert in something or we have a lot of knowledge, we want to push all that out to the reader, when in fact the reader may only need to know 20% of what we have to say. So I think when people become good technical writers and they learn how to write well, they learn how to stand where the audience is standing. In my field, we'd call it reader-based prose. So you start with, I'm the writer and I'm going to write everything that I think people need to know. Then you have to move to the stance of what does the reader actually need to know? What are the words that are going to be most effective? How can I structure this so that it gets to the main idea from the reader's point of view?
You mentioned the phrase plain language. Do you use that phrase interchangeably with technical communication, or do you see a difference between those two phrases?
Well, in the field of tech communication and in the field of plain language, they're sometimes used synonymously, and frankly, a lot of the strategies are the same. The difference really comes down to the fact that technical communication has a place in academia now. You know, I was tenured and my field was tech communication. I think the outside world, that is outside of the tech communication field, is getting used to the phrase plain language. And I prefer it because it says what it is. So if I say technical communication, it sounds like I'm communicating technical information. But if I say plain language, to me it sounds more like I'm going to communicate in a plain, easy manner.
So the phrase technical communication fails as technical communication.
Oh, well, I've just wiped out my entire academic career, Mark. I'm passing on that one.
You mentioned discourse communities, fields that have terms of art and vocabulary and jargon that is specific to their fields. How does plain language accommodate the precision of certain words within discourse communities that have to be communicated to a general audience?
That's one of the issues that we fight the hardest for or against. So, for example, in legal language, in the law, within the field of law, there are maybe a dozen actual terms that have to be used because they have standing in court. Much of legal language is simply tradition. This is how nerdy we get. We go back and forth with the use of shall when you really mean must. So every field has jargon that they think is precise and they think says exactly what they mean, but in fact, well, I'll give you a good example. So I've been doing some work on a lawsuit that I can't say too much about, but it had to do with people proving where they live in order to vote. Now, the act of proving where you live is called Verifiable Act of Domicile. Now, the word domicile has to be used because there's some legal reason, but domicile just simply means where you live. And saying where you live or the place where you live is just as exact as the word domicile. In fact, later they use the word abode as if that was going to be clearer. And so I think you'd be surprised how many fields are able to take those jargony words that are really shortcuts for the people who understand them, and using clear language, that information can be explained in a way that most people would understand. We just get into habits of using this kind of jargon.
Is plain language culturally specific?
We avoid calling it plain English because every language can use plain language. So in other words, there are companies like mine in Portugal that deal with plain Portuguese, or they call it plain language, but Portuguese, German, France, Western Europe, a lot of the countries there have people like me who work within the field itself. But that's a really good question, because in some cultures, for instance in Japan, it would be, and in fact, I actually wrote an article about this in which I said the way the Japanese use language is very similar to the way people in the South use language, which is they come at things in an indirect manner, which would be antithetical to plain language. They often avoid saying no, which also in some ways would be antithetical to plain language. Not that we're harsh, but people need to know what they can do. So I think in certain cultures, you probably would find that the idea of plain language would probably not fit as easily into how they think about the way people communicate.
I think of a company like Ikea that has stores all over the world. And within their furniture boxes, they have simple instructions that I assume follow plain language principles, so that way everyone, no matter who they are, can follow the directions. Is IKEA an example of plain language?
You know, I haven't really looked at it, but I think I would say yes. It's like Tinker Toys. Any kid in any country, anywhere, could put Tinker Toys together because all they were drawings, pictures. There wasn't language associated with it. And I may be the only person in the world who's never put a piece of furniture together from IKEA, but I understand that their instructions also are pictures. And so I think as long as you're using pictures in that way, the likelihood is you're going to get a very wide spread of people from cultures who will understand how to put that dresser together.
Is the way President Obama spoke often quite sophisticated, extensive, academic, precise? Is that plain language?
I would say no, but again, I would say you're looking at context. So for us, plain language tends to be more information within a transactional situation. So Obama's eloquence, however, I get your point that some of his sophistication, his eloquence, because he was, I think, great speaker and funny, etc., did put off people who looked at him as an elitist because of his extensive vocabulary, the syntax of his sentences, the references that he made, the metaphors that he used. For some people, that would have been off-putting, which probably gets us to Donald Trump.
Is the way Donald Trump speaks to his base plain language?
I would say it's plain language without ethics, because in my field, the ethical component, in other words, we expect that you use language that is truthful and that is accurate in order to convey information. So that's why we work against the use of fine print, for example. But yes, if you said to me, does Donald Trump speak to people who probably were put off by Obama's means of speaking, I would say yes. Someone did a readability study and said he talks like a fifth grader, which in some cases, writing like a fifth grader could be positive if you're going to tell me how much money I'm going to get back if I return this item. But we, at least in my field, we're very focused on the ethical use of clear language to convey truth and facts.
Are folks in your field ever accused of dumbing down the language?
Yeah, we fight against that all the time. And when people say dumbing down, I say no, it's wising up. If I can read something that is written at a 7th grade, 8th grade level, which is what the average adult reads in the United States, 7th or 8th grade, and I have a Ph.D., but I can get through that information in a snap, I'm elated. I wouldn't consider that dumbing down. I would consider that helping me get through that information more quickly. And again, we're speaking of transactional information. We're not speaking about great literature or how the Constitution was written, although actually the Constitution is relatively clear. So those folks knew what they were doing because they wanted at least the upper class to understand it. So I think people who talk about it as dumbing down don't really understand what we mean by plain language. So we mean making it easy for people to understand and use information that affects their daily lives. But I don't market myself as a writer. When I was a professor, I used to tell my student interns and my English majors not to market yourself as a writer, because writers are perceived to be a dime a dozen. And writers are perceived to be 35, 40, maybe $50 an hour if you're lucky. So I learned early on to market myself as a plain language expert. And so there's a way that I work with writers and English majors, or in the past did, to help them develop a sense of expertise that went beyond just the grammar and the organization. So now I have to understand what a regulation means when it says a privacy document has to be written in clear and conspicuous language. My expertise allows me now to say, I know what that is. I think our field has grown from that editing component that people, but I'm not an editor. And when I taught tech writing, we made this point very clear to our student, that editing is just kind of fixing what's wrong. Revising means you revision, that is, you re-see the entire document or website, you re-see the audience, you re-see the context, you re-see everything in terms of how an audience comes to read that information. And it's the revision that makes it more than just editing.
Why does this work interest you?
Well, my mom taught me to read when I was 4. So I've always loved language, always loved books. And I didn't go back to get my doctorate until I was in my mid-30s. And I had had a life out after my master's degree. And I liked the practicality of this. I believe that what I and many others do, I really believe it makes life better for people. So that if you sign a mortgage contract, I think we all have a right to understand information that affects our lives. I mean, we have a right to that. And in fact, Al Gore back when was one of the first to make that statement, so I'll have to give him credit. But that we are so often asked to agree to things we don't understand, to pay things we have no idea what this fee and that fee is. And I think that it's against my sense of ethics for people to be confused by language unnecessarily. So I love it. I mean, and it's practical, and again, this is how nerdy I am. To me, taking something that's complex, like terms and conditions for a credit card, and turning it into something that the average person could read, to me is a huge act of creativity. I mean, it is not just about the grammar and the words. It is about the whole concept, as I said earlier. And I find it to be very creative. I'm moving pieces around. I'm coming up with new terms. It's almost like painting something, or taking a piece of fabric that used to be used for a pillowcase and turning it into something beautiful that someone would hang on their wall. That, to me, is a deep form of creativity.
Deborah, who were you as a child?
I was quiet-ish, a reader. I read a lot. Played baseball outside when the kids were all outside running around. A bicycle rider. I know this sounds so pretentious, but I think I was kind of, I don't want to say an old soul, because that sounds like you figured everything out and you just, you're 5 years old. But I became pretty aware of how people behave and why they behave the way they do, and probably I should have become a therapist. But I spent a lot of time watching people, how they talked, how they interacted with each other, trying to figure out why did she and why did he, and picking up on the politics in middle school of how the girls were treating me and each other. And so and reading, constantly reading.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Decatur, Illinois. I was born in Chicago, which I would prefer to be from, but Decatur, Illinois, it was it was called the soybean capital of the world. So that was the claim to fame. Very blue-collar town. We had a big lake there, so that was very nice. But I wanted to get out of there as fast as I could. And I did. Never went back.
What was your family life like?
Oh, my family, well, my father was very funny. He was, which of course is probably why I married someone very funny. He was very, very funny. My mother was an interior designer, and she started her own business when she was 40 years old. And so I grew up in a home that we really weren't wealthy at all, but the house always looked beautiful because my mother knew how to design. She loved art, so she taught me about art very early. My father loved music, so they would play opera. Of course, now I can't stand opera, but you know how that goes. My father would sing. He would play the piano. Everybody in the house read a lot. I had 2 younger sisters. We did the appropriate amount of fighting. And my parents were very involved in civil rights. And so I grew up in an environment where helping other people was just what you did. Being Jewish also gives one a sense of social justice, and you know, that's part of our whole cultural makeup is tikkun olam, which means to heal the world, and that's what our job is. And so I think growing up in that environment, it made sense that even though it was accidental, that I became a professor, and then it made sense that I do what I do because all of it is helping others. I couldn't imagine, having a life in which serving others wasn't at least part of it.
What was your relationship with your parents?
I would say it was probably pretty normal, given that they're part of what we call the pre-psychological generation, right? So they were not particularly introspective. They weren't particularly psychological. I was very close to my mother until I was about maybe 15, 16, and then I think I just had that pull away that most teenage girls have. And I would say that we were not emotionally close, but everybody did what they needed to do that was the right thing to do. So when my parents got older, obviously I took care of them, and they were really good people. And really, the longer both of them are gone, the more every day I try to think of the positive things they taught me.
You grew up in a very interesting time in American history.
I did.
What were those times like for you?
Well, I entered college in 1965. So I was right in college at the time when hippies were beginning to be a thing. The war in Vietnam was raging. Friends of mine were being drafted or figuring out ways not to be drafted. Campus life was full of anti-authority, protests. I went to the University of Illinois in Champaign, Urbana, and I'll never forget, in 1968, I went to see Zabriskie Point, which is a movie about revolution in Greece, and I walked out of the movie and there's National Guard all over campus. So we were living in this sort of revolutionary time. And part of that time I'm very proud of. I think that without all of the agitation, the war in Vietnam could have gone on a lot longer. Other things I'm really not proud of, like the way we treated the Vietnam veterans when they came back. As an adult, I really look back and say, ooh, that was blaming the wrong people. But it was a time where you threw off authority. I learned never to trust leaders. You know that Bob Dylan, don't follow leaders, watch your parking meters. So I'm very kind of a rebellious person. I look perfectly normal, right? But I don't always think the same way that everybody else does. That whole period of my life, I am so grateful that I had it, because it taught me that if you stand up, you can make a difference.
Who would we have met if we had met Deborah in 1968?
Well, my husband occasionally said, God, I wish I knew her. I was actually relatively passive, the way girls were passive back then. It was all about what the guys wanted, and, the whole Black Panther thing about what's the right position for women in the Black Panthers, and I don't know, Stokely Carmichael said on their backs, right? And so, women Gloria Steinem was around, Betty Friedan, there was a lot of movement toward empowering yourself, but it took me a long time, till I'd say my mid-30s, to really become a self-contained person and somebody who stood up for herself and understood that I needed to chart my own course through my life, as opposed to connecting myself to a guy and then whatever he wanted to do, I did. And this was so common with women my age. I mean, I'm not, I don't stand out for being different in that respect. But over time, I just grew up. 1968, I was at the Democratic Convention in Grant Park in Chicago. And just as a little aside, I was there to help Eugene McCarthy, and as I'm wandering through the Conrad Hilton, Norman Mailer comes up to me, and because I was young and I was pretty then. But anyway, Norman Mailer comes up to me and says, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm here to help Eugene McCarthy. He said, no, you should be outside across the street in Grant Park. And I said, well, if Norman Mailer says I should do it. And so I left. My mother was in town. She met me there. And we were in Grant Park when the police rioted. And so that also, as far to the left or liberal as my parents were, that experience radicalized them even more and made them see a lot of the problems that were being covered over politically within the culture. So,
Not only were you at Grant Park, but you were at another iconic moment of the 1960s, Woodstock.
yes, I was. Yes, I was. So my boyfriend from Paterson, New Jersey, he and I had bought tickets to go to Woodstock, but we were in New Jersey, and all we heard was, "Don't come, there's hundreds of thousands, you can't drive up." And Ernest said, "All right, if they don't want us to go that badly, we have to go." So we did, drove up. I think we got within about 4 miles of Woodstock. And this was another fascinating thing. So as we're walking, it's raining, and there are thousands of us walking towards the Max Yasker farm, whatever it was called. And a farm couple is standing on the porch of their farmhouse watching this, really probably not understanding anything that's going on. And they motioned to Ernest and me, and they gave us raincoats and cups of hot tea. And they asked us what this was all about, and we told them we were just here for the music and that we don't think anybody knew this many people were going to show up. We had a lovely little chat, and then they sent us on our way. And then we spent the night. We were only there one day, one night, half a day. But yes, I was at Woodstock. And my daughter, who's 28, just thinks that's about the coolest thing ever.
Do you remember the bands you heard?
Jimi Hendrix playing in the morning. Beyond that, no. Sorry, it was Woodstock. Who remembers?
If you could listen to Grace Slick in 1968 in San Francisco, or Janis Joplin, who would you listen to?
Well, I actually, oddly enough, had that chance, and I went to listen to Grace Slick because I was 22, and Grace Slick was sexy and cool. But at my age now, I would listen to Janis Joplin because she was all about soul. And I think that's kind of a way to think about how my life has gone in some ways, from that young, hippie, long-haired young woman that wanted to be cool and sexy to now being older and understanding how important wisdom is and knowing that soul is really what's important.
Deborah, you went to the University of Illinois.
I did.
Why there?
Well, for one thing, my father went to the University of Illinois. So, I don't know, somehow in my household, it was just the assumed place that I was going to go. It was only 60 miles away. It was a state school, so therefore affordable. I was a good student, but certainly not Harvard material. I wasn't that ambitious. And I don't know, that was the only place I even applied. And it turned out to be great. I mean, I have friends from there, and I had wonderful professors. I had a Joyce scholar who was a professor of mine, and award-winning poets who taught in the poetry department, and I got a great education there.
What were your aspirations?
Well, okay, so here's the thing again about being a young woman at that age. So my mother used to tell me, if you're a woman, she didn't believe this should be, but she just was very pragmatic. If you're a woman, you probably should either be a nurse or a teacher, and then you can always get a job. So I got a BA in education. And then my senior year, when I did my student teaching, they sent me to Decatur to do my student teaching, and I taught creative writing in an English class where the English teacher was also the football coach. And I discovered that I loved the kids, but I didn't like the other teachers. They were bigoted. They were narrow-minded. They had already assigned words to define who these kids were and were not allowing the kids to show any other parts of themselves. And so I decided I'm not going to do this. So I graduated, I had a BA, and then I thought, well, maybe I should just get a master's degree. So I stayed 2 more years, got a master's degree in English, and then moved to Boston, where I was an editor at a very small publishing company, and lived in Cambridge in 1971. And one of the cool things about Cambridge then, Harvard Square. As I'm walking down the street, going by one of the cafeteria or cafes, there's Daniel Ellsberg in the window. And I was just like, oh, because the Vietnam papers had just been released, and it was just thrilling. And I liked being an editor at the publishing company. So I did that for a couple of years. And then I really sort of dropped out and lived wasn't a commune, but lived in a small community in Kentucky and taught myself how to be a bookbinder. I was a member of the Kentucky Guild of Artists and Craftspeople. I was the only bookbinder they had ever had. I made and sold blank books. And back then, you could live on $3,000-$4,000 a year. There I was among tons of artists and craftspeople and musicians, and everybody had a creative edge to them in one form or another. And so it was a very wide open environment where sometimes there'd be 6 of us living in a house together, and then sometimes of course, a few people actually got married, but it just was a whole different way of living your life. And in your early 20s, it was the right time to do something that was different. Every day seemed like an adventure. And we used to laugh that here we were in our 20s, and essentially we were all retired because none of us really had real jobs. So we sort of made up what it was we were going to do with our lives. I call myself the accidental entrepreneur, and I'll tell you why I say that. Because I started a bookbinding business and did really pretty well. Then later, when I realized I couldn't live like that forever, being a professor is being an entrepreneur. You don't really have a boss. You're very autonomous. You show up for your classes, but beyond that, you create your life, you create your areas of expertise, you determine what conferences you're going to attend, where you're going to publish. So that, to me, fit with my personality of being anti-authority. Didn't want anyone bossing me around. And it also fit in with the kind of helping thing. And I really, again, just kind of accidentally fell into that. I had a master's degree, a small private university, needed someone to teach English. I raised my hand, they hired me, and I discovered I really liked it. So John Lennon, was he the one who said, life's what happens when you're making other plans? That is really the story of my life. Life just sort of happened, and then I took advantage of whatever it was. I think I learned how to be myself, because I actually remember the moment when I decided to stop wearing a professor persona and just be me in the classroom. And then I found that by doing that, I was freer, the students responded to me better, and I did the same thing within my department. I'm a very direct person. I say what I think. I would give the kids honest feedback on what they were doing. I would encourage and support them. And doing that for them, also, I was doing that for myself. So I think being a professor really helped me immensely become the person that I am.
Deborah, what is on your bedside table now that you're reading?
There's a book of poems by Jane Hirschfield called October Poems. So I like to read poetry because it's short. It speaks to the plain language. Another part of my life, I actually was a published poet. So I read that. But most of the time, to be honest, I'm reading the New York Times and the New Yorker. For some reason, I've moved away from fiction. Maybe it's my pragmatic self is so, enmeshed in just how can I help people be better writers. But I would say most of the time, truthfully, it's the New York Times and the New Yorker.
Is there something that feeds your spirit?
My work feeds my spirit. Having conversations like this with you feeds my spirit. Attending Carlos Salam's salons feed my spirit. Anything that is intellectually stimulating, that provides beauty, because beauty is very important to me, laughing with my friends, and being engaged with my daughter and her life.
How are you wiser today than when you were young?
You know, I always wanted to be a wise person. I mean, I really did. And I think I figured out what wisdom means, and then I'll tell you how it functions. So knowledge is what you know, and wisdom is what you do with what you know. And so I think I'm wiser today because I know what I know, and I also know what I don't know. I'm very willing, and I learned that also as a professor, very willing to admit when I don't know something. And there's nothing more exciting to me than being in a room full of really smart people, and I learn things from them. You know, whatever the conversation might be, almost every day I'll go, I didn't know that. And now there's a little piece of knowledge that I didn't have. I think the wisdom part comes from interacting with people in such a way that I try to help. So maybe this isn't wisdom, it's just neuroses. But I mean, I give people advice all the time. If anybody wants to know what to do with their life, I can tell you. I don't know, I just feel like I'm a wise person. I don't mean wise like the Dalai Lama, certainly, but I think I understand human behavior, and I think I know what makes me happy, and I think I try to help my friends find what makes them happy. And then I'm wise enough to know that happiness is not a constant, and it ebbs and flows and comes and goes. And I think that I'm happy that I was able to have a life and to affect other people.
You mentioned your daughter.
Yes.
She works in Hollywood.
Yes.
What do you hope she has learned from you?
I consciously tried to work on this with her, so who knows if I've been successful. But first, to trust her instincts. I've taught her, I hope, how to stand up for herself, especially being a woman. I think that's really important. I tried to teach her how to be direct and ask for what you want. And I tried to teach her that it's important for her to help others. And I know that I've been successful in a couple of those, because she's always connecting people and helping people find jobs. And she's also very good about walking into a room and reading, you know, the nature and the tenor of the room. And so I think she and I have long conversations about people's behavior. So I think I've taught her that. So I think, yeah, and standing up for herself is really a big one.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thanks, Mark. This was great. Thank you.
Debra Bosley is the owner and principal of the Plain Language Group. She is a former professor of English at UNC Charlotte. She earned an undergraduate and master's degree in English from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and a Ph.D. in Rhetoric and Writing from Illinois State University. And now, a personal word. When I listen to Debra Bosley talk about communicating clearly and the music of the 1960s and helping others, she and I have a few things in common. There were three things that informed my youth: reading and writing, music, and a belief that we could make the world a better place. In 1972, I lived in Rego Park in a high-rise apartment in the borough of Queens in New York City. Our building was at the end of Burns Street and Thornton Place. I was in 4th grade, which is sort of like 7th grade now. We lived on the 2nd floor with a balcony where my father tossed quarters down to us when the Good Humor truck came by. I almost always got the toasted almond or strawberry shortcake bars, a red, white, and blue bomb pop, or a screwball if I wanted a brain freeze. After school, I would play street hockey, throw a plastic football between parked cars, build models of creature feature monsters, and play Rock'em Sock'em Robots or checkers and chess with my friends. My brother and 3 sisters were older than me. They were teenagers. They went to Russell Sage Junior High School. My oldest sister had started at Forest Hills High School. They wore bell-bottom jeans with patches and boots and vests with leather fringes. Their world was mysterious to me. When I wasn't playing with my friends, I was reading. Everything I could get my hands on. We had a set of World Book Encyclopedia. I would read a volume from cover to cover. I would look up words I didn't know in a Merriam-Webster dictionary. I once read a 1,000-page book on Chinese history. I would sit in my room and organize books on my shelf. I would write stories in pencil in a loose-leaf notebook. Then there was the music. The older kids played albums on portable turntables. The Beatles had broken up in 1970, and there were rumors they might reunite. How could they not? But Paul was holding a grudge. Others blamed John and Yoko. Someone had the new release of Sticky Fingers by the Rolling Stones, with the working zipper on the cover, but the kids who listened to the Beatles didn't talk much with the kids who listened to the Stones. Everything was in the air. Elton John and Rocket Man, Paul Simon and Me and Julio down by the schoolyard, Carly Simon and You're So Vain. I listened to my own personal anthem every day on the radio, Black and White by Three Dog Night. The ink is black, the page is white. Together we learn to read and write. A child is black, a child is white. A whole world looks upon the sight. A beautiful sight. I wish I could sing. All of what the world meant and what the teenagers did was out of reach for me, but the soundtrack was there. There were concerts at Madison Square Garden that people talked about. The concert for Bangladesh in 1971. Stevie Wonder and John Lennon on the same stage in 1972. Something about Jose Feliciano. The world was open. It could be made better. I was growing up believing I could make a difference. Reading and writing and the music of the early 70s and the sentiment of changing the world has followed me throughout my life. I have always had a book in my hand. I have always thought of myself as someone who communicated well. I have always listened to classic rock and pop to inspire and move me. I have always served and contributed and created work and taught with the hope and optimism that the world could be made better. It may be idealism that Deborah and I have in common, idealism that is beaten and battered in the rough and tumble of the times. I don't have any illusions about the world, but I do have a choice about how to live in the world. We all do. I'm grateful that Debra Bosley cares about words and music and helping others. What could matter more? This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Thank you to my partners Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, art and media director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value. Visit us also on our website, onlifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.